So I'm going to read the rest of chapter 1 with you now. You read the first couple of paragraphs in the other video, and now I wanted to take you through the task and the chapter so that you understood hopefully what was happening in the chapter and also what you needed to do with the task. So I will read, and then when we get to the pause points where we're going to pause, we're going to look to see what elements of the chapter have occurred. It chanced on one of these rambles that their way led them down a by-street in a busy quarter of London. The street was small and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on weekdays. The inhabitants were all doing well, it seemed, and all emulously hoping to do better still, and laying out the surplus of their gains in coquetry, so that the shop fronts stood along that thoroughfare with an air of invitation, like rows of smiling saleswomen. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighbourhood, like a fire in a forest. And with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. So here in this paragraph we have a description of a street, and it is a very positive description. You'll notice there are lots of positive descriptions, like the fact that it is quiet but drove a thriving trade, that the inhabitants were all doing well. Emulously means that they're almost kind of trying to copy each other to do better still. So they're kind of trying to keep up with each other. And they have all these different types of shops, and it's a very welcoming place, an air of invitation. Even on a Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighbourhood. So it's really showing that this street is sort of standing out as being a particularly pleasant one, with freshly painted shutters and well-polished brasses, clean and pleasing to the eye. 2 doors from one corner on the left hand going east, the line was broken by the entry of a court, and just at that point a certain sinister block of building thrust forward its gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story, and a blind forehead of discoloured wall on the upper, and bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and disdained. Tramps slouched into the recess and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop upon the steps. The schoolboy had tried his knife on the mouldings. And for close on a generation, no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors or to repair their ravages. So in the second paragraph, you can see a stark contrast. You've got this lovely street that's very pleasant to look at, and then this doorway with in a certain sinister block of buildings, sinister meaning evil or strange, with this discoloured wall and negligence, meaning it's been neglected, meaning no one's looked after it properly. It's blistered. And the idea that you've got tramps in the doorway and children playing and marking up the building. So it's a very different part of the street, and it really does show its contrast. Mr. Enfield and the lawyer were on the other side of the by-street, but when they came abreast of the entry, the former lifted up his cane and pointed. So we now have this list of elements, and you can see here in these boxes here, we're going to be seeing which of these have so far occurred in the story that we've read. You've got the mystery of the cheque, the description of Utterson's unease, the description of the sinister building, the decision to talk no more about this incident, the description of London streets, the history of the friendship between the 2 men, Enfield's decision to tell Utterson his story of the door, naming Hyde, the description of Utterson's appearance and character, the trampling of the little girl and her family's anger, and the story of the will. And as you can see, we're going to be asking you to decide which of those we have already covered. I will continue to read. Did you ever remark that door? He asked. And when his companion had replied in the affirmative, it is connected in my mind, added he, with a very odd story. Indeed, said Mr. Utterson with a slight change of voice. And what was that? Well, it was this way, returned Mr. Enfield. I was coming home from some place at the end of the world, about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, and my way lay through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps. Street after street, and all the folks asleep. Street after street, all lighted up as if for a procession, and all as empty as a church. Till at last I got into the state of mind when a man listens and listens and begins to long for the sight of a policeman. All at once I saw two figures, one a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and the other a girl of maybe 8 or 10 who was running as hard as she was able down a cross street. Well, sir, the two ran into one another naturally enough at the corner, and then came the horrible part of the thing, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man, it was like some damned juggernaut. I gave a view halloo, took to my heels, collared my gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a group about the screaming child. He was perfectly cool and made no resistance, but gave me one look so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. The people who had turned out were the girl's own family, and pretty soon the doctor for whom she had been sent put in his appearance. Well, the child was not much the worse, more frightened according to Sawbones, and there you might have supposed would be an end to it. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight. So had the child's family, which was only natural. But the doctor's case was what struck me. He was the usual cut-and-dry apothecary, of no particular age and colour, with a strong Edinburgh accent, and about as emotional as a bagpipe. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Sawbones turned sick and white with a desire to kill him. I knew what was in his mind, just as I knew what was in mine, and killing being out of the question, we did the next best. We told the man we could and would make such a scandal out of this as should make his name stink from one end of London to the other. If he had any friends or any credit, we undertook that he should lose them. And all the time, as we were pitching it in red hot, we were keeping the women off him as best we could, for they were as wild as harpies. I never saw such a circle of hateful faces. And there was the man in the middle, with a kind of black, sneering coolness. Frightened too, I could see that, but carrying it off, sir, really like Satan. If you choose to make capital out of this incident, said he, I am naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene, says he. Name your figure. Well, we screwed him up to £100 for the child's family. He would have clearly liked to stick it out, but there was something about the lot of us that meant mischief, and at last he was struck. The next thing was to get the money, and where do you think he carried us to but the place with the door? Whipped out a key and went in, and presently came back with a matter of £10 in gold and a cheque for the balance on Coots, drawn payable to bearer, and signed with a name that I can't mention, though it's one of the points of my story. But it was a name at least very well known and often printed. The figure was stiff, but the signature was good for more than that if it was only genuine. I took the liberty of pointing out to my gentleman that the whole business looked apocryphal, and that a man does not in real life walk into a cellar door at 4 a.m. and come out of it with another man's cheque for close upon £100. But he was quite easy and sneering. Set your mind at rest, says he. I will stay with you till the bank's open and cash the cheque myself. So we all set off, the doctor and the child's father and our friend and myself, and passed the rest of the night in my chambers. And next day, when we had breakfasted, we went to a body in the bank. I gave in the cheque myself, and said I had every reason to believe it was a forgery. Not a bit of it. The cheque was genuine. Tut, tut, said Mr. Utterson. I see you feel as I do, said Mr. Enfield. Yes, it is a bad story, for my man was a fellow that nobody could have to do with, a really damnable man, and the person that drew the cheque is the very pink of the proprietors, celebrated too, and what makes it worse, one of your fellows, who do what they call good. Blackmail, I suppose. An honest man paying through the nose for some of the capers of his youth. Blackmail House is what I call that place with the door, in consequence. Though even that, you know, is far from explaining all, he added, with the words fell into a vein of musing. Now, there are going to be a lot of words there that you're not going to necessarily be familiar with. And what I suggest you do is you go back through and you make sure you look up those words that you don't understand. The most important thing is that you understand the story, though, and that's why this checklist is so good. So what you can then think of is which of these elements have now been described to us in the chapter so far. When you come to do the task, you can pause the video and you can go back if you need to. But I'm going to read on. From this he was recalled by Mr. Utterson, asking rather suddenly, "And you don't know if the drawer of the cheque lives there?" "A likely place, isn't it?" returned Mr. Enfield, "but I happen to have noticed his address. He lives in some square or other." "And you've never asked about the place with the door?" said Mr. Utterson. "No, sir, I had a delicacy," was the reply. I feel very strongly about putting questions. It partakes too much of the style of the Day of Judgment. You start a question, and it's like starting a stone. You sit quietly on top of a hill, and away the stone goes, starting others, and presently some bland old bird, the last you would have thought of, is knocked on the head in his own back garden, and the family have to change their name. No, sir, I make it a rule of mine. The more it looks like Queer Street, the less I ask. So this little bit here gives us an indication that Enfield is really not wanting to kind of dig and find out why the person that he knows that he has not yet named would have written a cheque in order to pay off the deeds of this small, strange man that trampled the girl. And this also fits with this idea of being a Victorian gentleman, the fact that he would be not wanting to kind of create scandal or engage in gossip or kind of try and find something out. He would have seen it as not his problem. "A very good rule too," said the lawyer. "But I have studied the place for myself," continued Mr. Enfield. "It seems scarcely a house. There is no other door, and nobody goes in or out of that one. But once in a great while, the gentleman of my adventure. There are 3 windows looking on the court of the first floor, none below. The windows are always shut, but they're clean. And then there is a chimney, which is generally smoking. So somebody must live there. And yet it's not so sure, for the buildings are so packed together about that court, it's hard to say where one ends and another begins." The pair walked on again for a while in silence, and then, "Enfield," said Utterson, "that's a good rule of yours." "Yes, I think it is," returned Enfield. "But for that," continued the lawyer, "there's one point I want to ask. I want to ask the name of the man who walked over the child." "Well," said Mr. Enfield, "I can't see what harm it would do. It was a man of the name of Hyde." Said Mr. Utterson. "What sort of man is he to see?" "He's not easy to describe. There is something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarcely know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point. He's an extraordinary looking gentleman, and yet I really can name nothing out of the way. No, sir, I can make no hand of it. I can't describe him. It's not want of memory, for I declare I can see him this moment." So this is a really interesting description of Mr. Hyde, and we will be returning to this in future lessons, because it's really important that we understand, or try to understand, why Enfield finds it so difficult to put his finger on what he doesn't like about Hyde. And this is where we start to see the sort of pull between the rational, the Victorian rational thinking, and the supernatural, and something a bit strange or something a bit otherworldly. Mr. Utterson again walked some way in silence and obviously under a weight of consideration. "You're sure he used a key?" he inquired at last. "My dear sir," began Enfield, surprised out of himself. "Yes, I know," said Utterson. "I know it must seem strange. The fact is, if I do not ask you the name of the other party, it is because I know it already. You see, Richard, your tale has gone home. If you had been inexact in any point, you had better correct it." "I think you might have warned me," returned the other with a touch of sullenness. "But I have been pedantically exact, as you call it. The fellow had a key, and what's more, he still has it. I saw him use it not a week ago." Mr. Utterson sighed deeply, but never said a word, and the young man presently resumed. Here is another lesson to say nothing," said he. "I am ashamed of my long tongue. Let us make a bargain never to refer to this again." "With all my heart," said the lawyer. "I shake hands on that, Richard." And then we have, again, the list of elements. The mystery of the cheque, the description of Utterson's unease, the description of the sinister building, the decision not to talk no more of this incident, the description of the London streets, the history of the friendship between the two men, Enfield's decision to tell Utterson his story of the door, naming Hyde, the description of Utterson's appearance and character, the trampling of the little girl and her family's anger, and the story of the will. So if there's any elements there that we haven't covered, you can maybe point those out at this point. Okay, I'm going to leave you there, and we'll read more next time.